On the morning of the company's annual meeting, my son sent a message, not an invitation, not a reminder, just a short clip text. There's no need for you to come today. We've got it handled. That was it. No dad, no thank you. Just a dismissal, as if I were an old employee past relevance. But I wasn't an employee. I was the founder. I remember standing in the foyer, holding the phone, trying to absorb the weight of that message. The meeting was happening in a building I built, funded, and maintained. I'd walked those halls long before he had even learned how to hold a pen. And yet now I wasn't needed. That word echoed in my chest like a slap. Unneeded, unwelcome, uninvited. He didn't even have the decency to call. I sat down at the kitchen table, an old, scratched oak slab I once ate dinner over with his mother. She used to say, "You build something with love, and it'll never turn on you." I believed her. Until now. I still wore the same watch I had on the day we opened the doors to the company. The leather was cracked now, and the face a little fogged. But it still worked, just like me. The hurt didn't come all at once. It was slower than that, like a quiet freezing, like walking into a house you built only to find every room locked from the inside. Later that day, my assistant called. "I'm sorry, sir, I thought you knew," she said, voice nervous. "They changed the agenda this morning. Your name's not on the schedule anymore." Changed it. Without telling me. Without asking. As if I was just a footnote to my own story. But I didn't yell. Didn't storm in. Didn't demand anything. Because when a man has been stripped of everything but his dignity, that dignity becomes the loudest voice in the room. I looked at the empty chair where I usually sat during meetings, head of the table not because of rank, but because I'd earned it. And now that chair was filled by him, my son, smiling, shaking hands, talking as though he'd built it all with his bare hands, as though the blood, the sleepless nights, the second mortgage, the years I spent away from his school plays, from dinners, from birthdays, never existed. They said it was an oversight. But you don't forget the man who paid for the walls that hold your success. No, you erase him on purpose. And that's when I knew this wasn't carelessness. It was a coup. He wasn't just taking over. He was burying me, alive. And I let him think he had succeeded, because sometimes the quietest revenge is the one written in ink years before anyone thought to betray you, and mine was already signed. Friends, let's take a short pause. Could you write in the comments, where are you listening from? And tell me, have you ever experienced something like this in your life? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. That afternoon, the corridors felt colder than the polished marble would suggest. I still lingered by the door of my old office, where the scent of leather-bound ledgers and polished wood used to comfort me. My assistant, Anna, arrived quietly, her steps hesitant as though she feared the walls themselves might overhear. She placed a trembling hand on my shoulder, her eyes pleading. "Sir, you deserve to know what's happening," she murmured. Her words cut deeper than any accusation. She told me how he had maneuvered behind the scenes, twisting alliances, trading favors, painting me as a relic of the past. He described me to our board as outdated, sentimental, too soft for today's world. Each adjective felt like a razor against my pride. I had been nothing but devoted. Late nights, early mornings, sacrifices too many to count. And he repaid me by stripping away my legacy. I closed my eyes and saw every memory we shared. The day I let him hold a hammer for the first time. The Christmas morning we spent under half-finished beams. The proud smile on his face when he sold our first product. How could love turn into this calculated coup? My throat tightened, but I swallowed the ache. Anna's voice, softer now, reminded me of my strength. "They think your era is over, but they don't know you, sir." In that moment I felt something awaken. Not fury, but clarity. Betrayal is loud, but justice can be silent and sure. I squeezed Anna's hand, her loyalty warming me against the chill. I would let them believe I was beaten. I would watch them celebrate. And all the while, I would prepare the answer they'd never expect, forging my power not in shouts, but in the quiet precision of a final clause waiting to be revealed. The man I once carried on my shoulders now sent me papers, cold, clinical, and dressed in legal politeness. They arrived in a sleek envelope. No note, no greeting. just a revised agreement. On the surface, it looked routine. Formatting updates, wording changes, small adjustments for clarity. But clarity is a dangerous thing when wielded by someone who has something to hide. I sat at my desk. Not the one in the office they pushed me out of, but the old oak one in my study at home. The same one where I had signed the original incorporation documents decades ago. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the new contract, not from weakness, but from recognition. This wasn't paperwork. This was a quiet execution. Clause by clause, I saw the strategy. My voting rights, once the cornerstone of my authority, had been diluted to the point of irrelevance. My shares, once golden and founding, now labeled under a new classification, non-controlling. The word was sterile, but the intention screamed. I was being erased. It was methodical, ruthless, and cowardly. He counted on one thing, that I would trust him, that I would skim, that I would sign, as I had for years, trusting the son who once sat on my lap and asked what equity meant. But I taught him how to read contracts. I taught him to read between the lines. He just forgot who taught him. I took out the original agreement, yellowed at the edges, marked with the penmanship of a younger, hungrier version of myself. I placed it side by side with the new one, and then I began reading, line by line, word by word, paragraph by paragraph. No detail was too small, no sentence too familiar to skip. They say betrayal hurts most when it comes from family. But what they don't tell you is that family betrayal comes disguised as routine. I ran my fingers across the signature line. My name. The same name etched into the company's foundation stone. The same name he was trying to bury beneath corporate maneuvering and fine print. He forgot that ink may fade, but intention never does. So I picked up my pen, not to sign, but to begin. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with resolve. He had rewritten the contract. Now I would remind him who wrote the first one. There was a time when Sundays meant life in this house. Laughter echoing down the hallway, little feet racing from the front door to the kitchen, crayons on the coffee table, juice boxes on the porch, the warmth of family filling every room, spilling into the corners like sunlight through an open window. He used to come every weekend, like clockwork. My son, my grandchildren, they'd bring flowers from the market, homemade cards scribbled with grandpa in uneven letters, and stories from school, from soccer practice, from a world that still needed me. I'd cook for them, slow, careful meals seasoned with patience and pride. And when they left, I would stand by the gate, waving, heart full and tired in the best way. But the Sundays changed. They didn't stop suddenly. That would have made sense. Instead, they faded, like color bleeding out of an old photograph. One weekend missed because of a meeting, another because of a cold, then nothing, just silence. I told myself they were busy, told myself he would call, told myself maybe I had missed something, a voicemail, a message, anything. But the mailbox stayed empty. The phone didn't ring, and my birthday came and went with nothing but the sound of the old clock ticking in the hallway. I didn't cry. It's strange how pain teaches you to hold yourself still, as if movement might break what little you have left. I sat in my armchair, the one where I used to read bedtime stories to a boy who once looked at me like I could move mountains. And I stared at the doorway. No knock, no footsteps, just the quiet. But silence has a weight of its own. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors. It just lingers. It stretches across rooms, sits in empty chairs, whispers in the quiet moments between meals. Some people fear yelling. I feared that silence more, because yelling means someone still cares enough to make noise. But silence? That's when they've turned the page and left you out of the chapter entirely. Still, I didn't reach out. Not because I didn't long to hear their voices, but because I understood. I understood that when people want distance, they build it, brick by brick, with indifference, with absence, with justifications that feel like progress to them and punishment to you. So I waited, not for them, but for something deeper. Because while silence can feel like a burial, it can also be the place where strength takes root. And in that quiet, I remembered, a man's worth isn't in how many times the phone rings. It's in what remains when no one calls. And I was still here, not finished, just beginning to remember who I was without their noise. The restaurant still smelled like it did on opening day. cedar and citrus with a faint warmth from the brick oven in the back. I chose that scent. I picked every tile, every chair, every light fixture. Even the music, soft jazz looping through the speakers, came from an old playlist I made with his mother before she passed. We used to dream of this place over kitchen table plans and coffee-stained napkins. It was supposed to be a gift for the city, a gathering place, a legacy. I never intended it to become the stage for my own erasure. That afternoon, I sat at my usual table near the back window. The servers still knew me, some too young to remember the early days, but trained by those who did. They greeted me with polite warmth, the way one does with a man remembered more for history than presence. I stirred my tea slowly, my hands steady but heavy. The door swung open. A familiar voice filled the space. It was him, my son, confident, polished, laughing too loudly at something a client had said. He led 3 men to a table in the center of the restaurant, the one beneath the custom chandelier I commissioned in her memory. That chandelier alone cost more than my first house. But he didn't glance up, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the weight of what hung above him. He talked as though he had built it all. I could hear him clearly, every boast, every carefully curated anecdote, every sentence that began with "when I launched this," or what I had in mind when designing. I watched as he traced the story of my work with his words, offering up my sacrifices as his own stepping stones. And then they stood to take a tour. I knew the path. They would walk past the wine cellar, through the kitchen window's viewing pane, and then past the back corner, past my table. I didn't move. I didn't hide. I wanted to believe, just for a moment, that maybe he'd look over, that he'd meet my eyes, that he'd remember the nights I came home covered in dust from construction, or the mornings I brought him here before school, letting him spin in the swivel chairs while I negotiated contracts on a flip phone. But when he passed me, he didn't flinch. He didn't slow. He didn't even see me. As if I were just another old man having lunch alone. As if the man who built his castle was now just a ghost haunting it. And maybe I was. But ghosts remember. They remember every brick laid in love, every loan risked, every missed anniversary, every broken back, every hope pinned to a child who was meant to carry the dream forward, not tear it from your name. That lunch wasn't bitter. It was clarifying, because sitting in that chair, invisible in a place I'd once poured my heart into, I realized something. You can lose your name off a wall. You can lose your seat at the table, but you cannot lose the truth. Not when you've lived it. And the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It waits, quietly, until the time is right to be heard again. The call came late on a Thursday. I had just come in from watering the small garden in the back, something to keep my hands busy, something to remind myself that things still grow even after loss. The tomatoes were finally showing color, and for a moment I felt proud again. Not corporate pride, not legacy pride, just the simple joy of watching something bloom in silence. Then the phone rang. It was Thomas, my attorney. He'd been with me from the beginning, through every contract, every expansion, every cautious deal negotiated late into the night. His voice had aged, but the concern in it now was sharp and immediate. "They're holding a vote next week," he said. "Your son has the numbers. He's calling for your removal from the board. Not honorary, not emeritus, full removal." I didn't speak at first. I simply listened. The weight of it wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. A final stone placed on the quiet grave he'd been digging for months. "They think you won't fight," Thomas added. "They're counting on you to bow out. No noise, no mess, just a signature and silence." I sat down in the chair across from the fireplace, staring into the cold ashes of last winter's flame. Funny how things can still look warm long after the fire's gone. They thought I wouldn't fight. They thought I'd go quietly. And in a way, they were right, because I wouldn't fight. Not the way they expected. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't make a scene. I wouldn't beg for a seat at a table I built with my own bare hands. I wouldn't humiliate myself to hold on to a title that meant nothing without honor behind it. But they misunderstood what silence really meant. To them, silence was surrender. To me, it was strategy. You see, I had already done my fighting. Not in courtrooms, not in conference rooms. I fought when I stayed up until 3 a.m., balancing the first budget by candlelight. I fought when I mortgaged our home to keep the business alive during the lean years. I fought every single time I chose integrity over profit, people over power, vision over vanity. I had already fought and I had already won. This new battle, it wasn't about the company. It was about dignity, and that they could never take. So I told Thomas to prepare the paperwork, not because I was giving in, but because I wanted them to believe I had. I would sign what they needed me to sign. I would play their game. I would let them declare their hollow victory, because I knew something they didn't. There are two kinds of signatures in this world, the one they see, and the one you hid in plain sight years ago, written so carefully no one thought to question it. And that second one, it was waiting, tucked deep in the foundations. Signed, stamped, sealed. Truth doesn't panic. It prepares. And mine was almost ready to speak. The boardroom hadn't changed much since the day we first signed the founding agreement. The long mahogany table still gleamed under the same overhead lights I chose from a catalog my wife and I browsed at midnight years ago. The leather chairs had been reupholstered, the coffee upgraded, the suits more expensive, but the soul of the room was the same. Except now I was the ghost in it. They offered me a seat at the far end. Not the head, not even beside it, just a chair. A courtesy. Like you might offer to an aging relative who doesn't understand how the world works anymore. I sat in silence as they passed around the glossy folders, thick with legal confidence. They'd worked hard on this, long nights with lawyers, secret calls, alliances forged in half-truths and ambition. I was no longer their mentor. I was their inconvenience. And my son, my only son, sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at me, not once. He read aloud the motion, his voice steady, proud, rehearsed. He thanked me publicly for my years of service and foundational vision, words meant to soften a knife. Then he turned to me. "Dad, if you're ready." It was the first time he had called me Dad in weeks, and somehow it stung more than silence. I took the pen, the same model we'd used back in '91 when we closed our first major deal. I uncapped it slowly, like it might still hold the weight of old victories, and without ceremony, I signed the documents. 1, 2, 3. My hand didn't shake. I heard the quiet sighs of relief around the room. Chairs creaked as people settled back, the tension dissolving into smugness. My son gave a small nod to someone across the table. It was done. The transition was official. The founder had stepped down. The throne was his now. I looked at him then, really looked. And in his eyes I saw none of the fear I once had when building this from nothing, none of the gratitude, none of the sleepless nights, only ambition, polished and gleaming, sitting on someone else's foundation. He thought I had surrendered, but what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my surrender was the final move in a game I had started before he ever learned to write his name. Because buried deep in the original founding agreement, in the appendix no one ever bothered to review, was a clause, written in plain language, tucked between tax language and zoning rights, overlooked by a board too eager to rise, forgotten by a son too hungry for power. It read, "In the event that the original founder is removed or voluntarily steps down, all core trademarks, licenses, and naming rights revert solely and irrevocably to the original founder, unless unanimously voted otherwise, by the founding board members. But those founding members, all retired, all loyal, all signed. 32 years ago, I protected this company, not with noise, but with foresight, with ink, with the quiet understanding that legacies can be rewritten unless you etch them in stone before the storm comes. They would discover it soon enough. Not in that room, but in court. Not with shouting, but with silence, followed by the sound of everything they thought they stole, slipping through their fingers. And me? I left the room calm, because the signature they watched me make wasn't the one that would matter. After her funeral, the house felt impossibly quiet. Not the kind of quiet you grow to appreciate, but the kind that echoes. Every room held her imprint, her scarves draped over chairbacks, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, her favorite tea still sitting untouched in the cabinet. I kept everything where it was, not because I couldn't move on, but because I wasn't ready to forget. She had always been the voice of balance. Where I was firm, she was soft. Where I planned, she prayed. And when I poured myself into building the company, she poured herself into building something far more sacred, our family, our son. In her final weeks, when the illness was no longer something we could ignore, she asked me for a box, not to pack her things, to write. She wrote slowly, carefully, pages folded into envelopes marked with names, some for me, some for her siblings, but one envelope she held longer than the rest, her hands trembling slightly as she sealed it. "For him," she said, her voice a whisper. "Give it to him when the time is right. Not before, not too late." I nodded, though I didn't understand then what she meant. I thought he'd read it. I thought her words would reach him in ways mine never could. When the board voted me out, and the silence between us had stretched too long, I finally brought the letter to his office. He didn't greet me. He barely looked up. But I placed it on his desk and said only, "It's from your mother." He didn't ask what was in it. He didn't even open it in front of me. I left, heart heavier than I had expected. Maybe I had still hoped for something. A pause, a tear, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. But pride is a loud thing, and her voice was quiet. Days later, I found out what he'd done. He had read the first line, then tossed it into the fireplace, as if her final words were an inconvenience, a relic. As if wisdom from the woman who birthed him, raised him, prayed over his sleeping form every night, could be reduced to ash without consequence. But I had read it, before I handed it over. I had read every word, my hands shaking the way hers must have when she wrote it. Power isn't inherited, son, it's earned with humility. One day you'll have the title. But if you forget the people, the purpose, the pain that built it, you'll be sitting on a throne of sand. And the tide always comes. He burned the paper, but fire can't erase the truth. It only transforms it. And even in ashes, her words lived on. Because legacy doesn't live in buildings or titles or signatures. It lives in character, in how you treat the people who loved you before you had anything to offer, in whether you remember the hands that lifted you up, or rewrite the story to pretend you climbed alone. He had her eyes, but he lost her vision. And that, perhaps, was the saddest inheritance of all. Still, I kept a copy, not for him, but for his children. One day, when they're old enough to understand the weight of a name, I'll show them the words their grandmother wrote, so they can learn what their father forgot. They dressed it up in civility, pressed suits, catered coffee, polite nods, but beneath the surface it was a funeral, mine, or at least that's how they intended it. The final board meeting, the vote, the moment they would sever the last tie between me and the company I had built from nothing but grit, faith, and sleepless nights. The conference room was full. Not a single empty seat. They had made sure of that. Some faces looked away when I entered. Others offered tight smiles, the kind you give to someone you're about to betray. A few looked smug, as if they were finally getting their turn at the table, now that the old man was on his way out. And at the head sat my son, polished, poised, rehearsed, his hands folded on the table like a politician waiting for applause. He called the meeting to order with a calm, commanding voice, like he'd always been in charge, like this company hadn't grown up in my garage, on the back of overdue bills and broken-down trucks, like he hadn't learned to walk between factory aisles and conference calls. Then came the motion. To formally remove the founder from the board and all active governance roles. Not a murmur, no hesitation. Just hands, one by one, rising into the air. Even my nephew, the boy I paid to put through college when his father walked out, raised his hand. Unanimous. A word that once meant unity now tasted like rust. No one looked at me. Not really. They were too focused on what came next. New roles, new titles, new rooms to decorate in their image. I sat there and nodded. Not out of agreement, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. They thought they had won. They thought a vote could erase a name. But the truth is, they were voting on top of a foundation they didn't understand and didn't build. The paper in front of them was clean, but the floor beneath them was mine. Every chair they sat in had once been assembled by my hands. Every department they now managed was born from a late-night sketch I once drew at a kitchen table beside a sleeping child. They had forgotten that legacy is not a title you inherit. It's a structure you either uphold or collapse under. So I stood, slowly, letting the moment breathe, letting them think I was conceding. And then I walked out. No slamming doors, no final speech. Just the quiet footsteps of a man who knew something they didn't. The vote may have passed, but the foundation still bore my name. And the ink they ignored? was about to speak louder than all their raised hands combined. I didn't attend the emergency meetings that followed. I didn't return the frantic phone calls. Didn't answer the late-night messages disguised as just clarifying a few points. I simply waited, because truth has no need to chase panic. It arrives when it's ready, and it always arrives. They discovered it on a Tuesday. It had been a full week since the vote, since the handshakes, the press release, the photo of my son in my old chair with a caption that read, "The new chapter begins." I clipped it out, folded it, and tucked it into a drawer, not out of sentimentality, out of irony, because while they celebrated a transfer of power, they forgot to read the fine print that had been there since the first brick was laid. The clause sat quiet for 32 years, hidden but not lost, reviewed by only a handful of people over the decades. One sentence, one line, one truth. In the event that the original founder is removed, whether voluntarily or by vote, all legal rights to the company's name, brand identity, and licensing revert immediately and unconditionally to said founder, unless the founding board unanimously agrees to a separate arrangement. A simple safeguard. A quiet shield I placed there not out of distrust but out of duty. Not to protect myself, but to protect what I had built from greed, wrapped in familiar faces. And now it spoke. Their attorneys scrambled. They tried to call it a loophole, an oversight, a relic. But law does not favor noise. It favors clarity. And this clause was clear. It had been signed by every founding member, notarized, witnessed, filed. They tried to claim I had forfeited the right by stepping down. But the clause was never about position. It was about removal. Their vote, in its arrogance, had triggered the very trap they had overlooked. And then came the hearing. I didn't need to bring a crowd. I brought a copy of the original charter, preserved in a binder I'd kept in a fireproof box since the year my son lost his first tooth. The judge read it twice, then once more, and then she looked at the room, not at me but at them, at the executives who'd replaced me, at the board members who had cast their votes with smiles, at my son who sat with a forced calm, hands clenched in his lap. Her voice was firm, not cruel, but unmoved. "This clause is enforceable," she said, "and binding." Just like that. No fireworks, no outrage, just silence. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the slow, dawning horror that everything you built on someone else's name was never yours. Their branding? Frozen. Their licensing? Revoked. Their agreements? Null. The company they thought they took over no longer legally existed without the name attached to it, my name. I didn't gloat. I didn't even look at him, my son, the man who used to draw castles on napkins and call me his hero. I just gathered my binder, buttoned my coat, walked quietly past the row of stunned expressions, because in the end, power doesn't need to raise its voice. Sometimes all it takes is one line. The courtroom smelled of old paper, wood polish, and tension. It was the kind of room where history sits in silence, watching people repeat the same mistakes dressed in newer suits, where justice doesn't always come loud or quickly, but when it does, it comes with a weight you can feel in your chest. I sat quietly near the back, not at the table with the lawyers, not up front with the noise. I didn't need to be seen. I had been seen for decades, in company photographs, on foundation stones, in speeches no one remembers but that built the ground under their feet. I was done performing. Now I was just waiting. Across the room, my son sat with his legal team, his jaw set, his shoulders back, trying to look composed, but his eyes betrayed him. He scanned the room too often, blinked too quickly. He wasn't ready for this, not because he didn't expect a fight, but because he never imagined I'd still be holding the sword he thought I laid down years ago. The judge entered, and all rose. She was precise, experienced, unimpressed by theatrics. She didn't waste time. She flipped through the document slowly, her finger tracing lines, her brow furrowed in concentration. The room was still, like the seconds before a storm hits. And then she read the clause aloud, word for word. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise for effect. It simply spoke the truth. And in that truth, the ground began to shift. In the event that the original founder is removed, all core licenses, naming rights, and intellectual property shall immediately and irrevocably revert. It was as if someone had cut the air itself. No one moved. Even the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed to pause. My son's head tilted slightly, as though he hadn't heard it right. One of his lawyers leaned forward, whispering frantically. Another flipped pages, searching for a way out. And then his voice, quiet at first, broken at the edges. "This can't be real." But it was. It was real. It was typed on paper so old you could still smell the age in its fibers. It was marked with my initials, the same ones I've signed since before he was born. It was dated, back when he was just a child running through the hallways of our first office, sticky fingers and wide eyes. It was notarized, sealed with care, long before any of them imagined I'd need protection from the very blood I gave everything for. He stared down at the page like it was a betrayal, but it wasn't. It was a safeguard. He thought legacy meant control. He thought removing me from the board meant rewriting the past. But legacy isn't a throne you take. It's a foundation you stand on. And when you dig at the foundation without understanding what's holding you up, it crumbles. The whispers in the room grew louder. Phones buzzed. Executives exchanged glances. The panic wasn't theatrical. It was real. Contracts would collapse. Partnerships would dissolve. Entire campaigns, branding efforts, legal protections, gone because they forgot to ask one simple question. What if the old man didn't forget? And I hadn't. I had remembered everything. Because while they were busy rushing to power, I was writing the quiet ending to a story they didn't even know they were in. I stood and buttoned my coat again, slowly, calmly. Not in triumph, not even in vengeance, but with the dignity of a man who knew he never needed to scream to be heard, only to wait, long enough for the truth to catch up. And now it had. It didn't fall all at once. That's the thing about collapse. It's never as dramatic as the movies. There's no single moment of explosion, no flaming headlines or gasps. No, real collapse begins quietly, like a hairline crack in a glass that no one notices, until it shatters in their hands. The day after the ruling, the first call came in. A longtime client, one of the original contracts we'd held since the second year of business. A family-owned distributor who had trusted our brand for generations. They called to confirm the status of the agreement now that the ownership was in flux. But I knew what they were really asking. Who does this company belong to now? They didn't like the answer. Hours later, a major supplier paused their next shipment. Their legal team wanted clarity around licensing, liability, and branding rights. And clarity, unfortunately for my son, now rested in my hands, not his. By the end of the week, a whisper campaign had turned into a thunderstorm. Investors, some of whom I'd known since before my son was even in high school, began pulling out. Quietly, strategically, no anger, just absence. The company's website was taken offline, pending rebranding. Emails bounced. Phone calls went unanswered. Even the sign outside the main office, a logo etched in steel, bold and proud, was covered with a gray tarp. They said it was for repairs, but everyone knew. They weren't fixing anything. They were hiding the wound. Inside those offices, panic bloomed behind glass walls. Staff meetings turned into emergency briefings. Consultants were called in, crisis managers hired, but none of it mattered. Because you can't stabilize a building if the foundation was never yours. My son tried to hold it together. I heard about the speeches, the promises, the reassurances. He told them it was a temporary glitch, that the brand would bounce back, that they were bigger than any one person. But it wasn't about a person. It was about principle. And control taken through ego, without gratitude, without honor, was never real control at all. It was only ever borrowed. And the debt had come due. He tried to rebrand, tried to launch under a new name. But trust doesn't move that fast. Not when it's been cracked. Not when the face of betrayal is still sitting in the corner office, pretending nothing has changed. Employees began to leave, some in silence, some with final emails that said everything they hadn't dared to speak before. The ones who remembered the early days, the factory floor, the team potlucks, the nights we celebrated small wins like they were miracles, those were the first to walk, because they knew. They knew what had been lost wasn't just a name. It was a soul. And once a company loses that, no amount of rebranding can save it. I watched it unfold not with satisfaction, but with a quiet ache. Because, as much as he had taken from me, I had never wished for him to fail. I only wanted him to remember where he came from, who he came from, and what it costs to build something that lasts. But he chose to forget. And so, the The company he thought he'd conquered forgot him back, piece by piece, client by client, brick by brick, until all that remained was a man sitting in an empty office holding a title over a kingdom made of sand. It was raining the night he came, not a thunderstorm, just that steady, relentless kind of rain that soaks everything without warning, softens the ground, makes the world quieter, the kind of rain that demands stillness. I heard the knock, slow and uncertain. I didn't rush to the door. There was no reason to. Time had already stretched long between us. What was a few more seconds? When I opened it, he stood there without an umbrella. No briefcase, no suit jacket, just a soaked shirt, sleeves rolled up, and eyes that looked older than they should have. There were no cameras behind him, no lawyers, no board members, just him, my son. The boy who used to build towers out of cereal boxes in the living room. The teenager who once broke the company copier trying to print flyers for his band. The man who had once looked at me with awe, and later, with ambition that turned to something colder. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, the rain dripping from his collar, hands clenched at his sides. His lips moved slightly, as if testing words before letting them out. I stepped aside and let him in. We didn't go to the kitchen. We didn't sit at the dining table where birthdays used to be loud and full. I led him to the old study, my quiet place, where the smell of leather and paper still lingered, where I had written the original charter for the company he nearly buried. He sat down slowly, almost like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. His fingers tapped against his knee, a nervous rhythm I recognized from childhood when he lied about breaking a window. But this wasn't a lie. This was the end of one silence and the beginning of another. He looked at me finally, and his voice came out smaller than I expected. How did you know? Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Not even why did you do it? Just that one question, almost whispered. How did I know? I thought about all the ways I could answer, all the nights I'd stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the sting of betrayal. All the versions of him I had known, the boy, the man, the stranger. I thought about the claws, the meeting, the cold walk out of the boardroom that had once been my sanctuary. And then I gave him the truth. Because I built this for love, I said quietly, not for applause. That was it. He looked down then, maybe ashamed, maybe just exhausted. I didn't push. There was no need. Some truths don't need to be argued or defended. They just sit in the room like gravity, undeniable, steady, always pulling you back to what matters. He stayed for a while, though we didn't say much else. I made us tea, like his mother used to. He held the mug in both hands like he was trying to absorb warmth from something that had long gone cold. We sat in the quiet, not as enemies, not even as businessmen, just a father and son, and the space between us where everything had gone wrong. Before he left, he paused at the doorway, glancing once more at the room. At me. He didn't apologize. And I didn't ask him to. Because sometimes the deepest lessons don't end in forgiveness. They end in recognition. And in that moment I saw it in his face. He knew what he'd lost. And he finally understood why it had never been his to take. It didn't take long. Barely a month after the collapse began, the same voices that once voted me out, the same hands that rose with such quiet confidence, began to reach out again. The tone was different now. Gone was the certainty, the superiority, the subtle dismissal. In their place, urgency, apology, desperation. They called it an error in judgment. They called it a misunderstanding. Some even had the nerve to call it a miscommunication. But I knew what it was. Fear. Not fear of me, but of the vacuum I left behind. Because when you remove the roots, the tree might stand for a moment, but the wind always comes. They invited me to dinner, the same upscale restaurant I once couldn't afford to take my wife to when we were saving every penny to buy the office copier. This time, I sat at the head of the table again, not because I demanded it, but because they were suddenly remembering who paid for the table in the first place. They offered me everything. The chairmanship, full control, a press campaign to announce my visionary return, even naming the new expansion wing after me. They said it was time to restore what matters. But I didn't want restoration, not like that. 'Cause some things, once tainted, shouldn't be picked up again just to prove a point. I listened politely, let them finish their speech, and then I stood, reached into my briefcase, and pulled out a simple document. It bore a single name. My son's. Their faces fell before I even spoke, because they knew I was giving it back, not out of surrender, not out of approval, but out of something deeper, something they had long since forgotten. Integrity. I looked around the room, at the executives who used to watch me like students, at the new faces who had never known the early days, at the empty eyes of people who once believed a brand could survive without its soul. And I said no, not with anger, not with spite, but with clarity. No titles, no chair, no legacy clawed back with bloodied hands. What I built was never meant to be a crown. It was meant to be a compass, and compasses don't work when they're dragged through ego. Then I handed them the document. I gave him the name, not because he had earned it, not yet, but because one day he might, if he chose to build, not take, if he learned to lead without needing to crush, if he stopped chasing applause long enough to listen for quiet truths, because true legacy isn't about reclaiming what was stolen. It's about choosing what not to stain. And that day, I chose not to reclaim with bitterness what I had once built with love. I walked out of that restaurant feeling lighter than I had in years, not because I regained something, but because I let it go clean. The first time I walked those halls, there were no portraits, just bare walls, chipped paint, and echoes of possibility. We didn't have investors back then, just sweat, just long nights, half-empty thermoses, and a belief that if we did things right, not fast, not loud, but right, it would matter. We never planned for portraits. We planned for people, but people forget. Walls sometimes remember. Years passed. The company grew. The hallways filled, not just with employees and noise and traffic, but with photos, recognition, milestones, faces, success framed in gold. And somewhere along the way, mine disappeared. Not overnight, but slowly, like dust settling on something you no longer notice. First it was the team banners without my name, then the press releases written in new voices, then the annual reports that credited fresh leadership with strategies I'd planted long ago. When they removed my last photograph from the founder's wall, no one told me. I found out by accident. A former janitor's son messaged me a blurry picture one day. "Thought you'd want to know, sir," he said. My frame, once centered, now replaced with something sleek, something sterile. I didn't respond, because I wasn't angry, just quiet. But life, in its strange mercy, has a way of coming back around, not always with vengeance, but with honesty. And sometimes that's more powerful. It happened quietly again. No announcement, no grand unveiling. I was visiting a retired colleague who still worked as a consultant. We were walking the halls when I saw it. A soft light overhead, a new arrangement on the gallery wall, photos of the company's origin, the very first blueprint, the first team in grainy black and white, faces that had grown old, some gone. And in the center, mine. Not a young version either, not the ambitious dreamer in rolled-up sleeves. But me now, older, wiser, weathered by time, but still standing. There was no plaque beneath it screaming my name, just a single line engraved in quiet brass. Founding mind, steady hand. I stood there for a long time, not because I needed the recognition, but because I finally saw it framed the way it was meant to be. Not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as a reminder. That building something is never about shouting the loudest. It's about showing up, staying through the storms, writing the words no one reads until everything falls apart, and then realizing those words were the ones holding it all together. I don't walk those halls often now. I leave that to the next generation. Let them make their noise. Let them learn their lessons. Let them think they're leading something new. Because the man who builds the house doesn't need to knock to be let in. He knows where the keys are buried. And he knows the quietest man in the room is often the one who wrote the rules.